As many of you know, I'm an enormous DC Comics fan, but I didn't start reading comic books till a little bit later in life. I haven't been through all the high points and low points that a lot of lifelong comic book readers have, like my good friend Josh McDonald, the Batman historian and the DC aficionado. How you doing, Josh?
I'm doing well, Wes. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. So I want to talk about where are we at in the history of DC Comics, at least the recent history. We're not going to go back to the golden era or anything like that. But, it feels like DC Comics is in a down period. We certainly shows through in the sales that they're having issues with. They're not really as prevalent in the top 50. It looks like their graphic novel sales are dropping tremendously. Doesn't feel like DC is in a high note right now, especially quality-wise. I think that's where they're really lacking. There's just not a lot of good writers. They had so many good quality writers like a Scott Snyder, a Jeff Johns, who's not really writing for them very often anymore. Peter J. Tomasi, your Dan Jurgens, your Robert Vendittis, your Dan Abnett's, they're not really doing anything with DC when that was a sudden change, and they're obviously transitioning. The industry is cyclical. You get up periods, you get down periods, but this feels like a really down period. You've been through the New 52. You've been through a lot of other down periods with DC. What kind of down period is this? Is it substantial? Is it just a blip in the radar?
It's weird. I hope that it's just a blip in the radar, but I can't say that I feel confident that it is. I think it's going to last a little bit longer to make it something other than a blip. But yeah, I agree with you. For me, from a quality standpoint, it does feel like it's a drop in quality. And I don't even mean like, oh, I don't care for this. There were plenty of books. You mentioned the New 52. There were plenty of people that had issue with the New 52 because of how it altered characters. And I was able to look at that, understand some of the lack of enjoyment of that, but still look at these books and go, yeah, they're kind of like screwing with the character, but this is still a good book. And for the most part, a majority of the books were good to read, especially early on. I find it harder and harder to pick up books that I actually enjoy. Even then, when I do enjoy things, it's more of like, yeah, it was fine. And the fact that I'm saying, yeah, it was fine is refreshing than being like, oh, God, this was terrible. We're just in a really weird period where, I talk about the craft of writing a lot, and I don't think the craft of writing is there. I don't think the craft of storytelling is there, and it's coming through, it's showing. And even if common readers can't pinpoint what might be wrong with the book, there are issues there. And we unfortunately live in a world where editors aren't giving notes or can't give notes, or it's such a like, we love each other, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya gang, that no one's going to give any type of criticism, even if it's constructive. So yeah, the books are not great at the moment.
I don't even know what this era is. Obviously, you can kind of define what the New 52 era is. Are we in the Infinite Frontier era? They got rid of the trade dress almost immediately after Infinite Frontier began. I don't even know what this is. It just feels like the dead era, where they just got rid of all their talent and we're just sitting here, holding the bag for these really expensive, overpriced, bad comic book stories, and they're constantly messing with the characters, which, what you mentioned earlier happened in the New 52, but at least there was quality storytelling. You're messing with all the characters. You're kind of doing a lot of deconstruction. You're trying to do a lot of mantle swaps here, but you don't have the quality to back it up. And I think it just shines a light on it so much brighter than before, because it's clear as day what's wrong with DC Comics. You're like, I don't like any of this for the most part. And it's hard to fall back because the quality isn't there just to kind of give you a good feeling, at least when it's over.
Yeah. It's like, I think there's so many things that come into play here, and it's something we've talked about before, but, starting from the top to the bottom, it doesn't feel like there's an actual direction. So, you don't feel like you're leading towards something, or that there's a vision. It's just everyone's kind of doing their own thing. DC tried to go as cheap as they could, so they hired cheap talent from a writing perspective. Thankfully, the artists that we have are decent to solid. But yeah, it's like, we threw out quality writers to get a bunch of no names. And I don't mean that as disrespect. Everyone has to start somewhere, but you don't take someone that doesn't have a history and doesn't have, a resume that's credible and throw them on your top tier books. Like that's just career suicide for them. And it's just going to implode your company. But that's what DC has done. Instead of like realizing this was a mistake and course correcting, they just doubled down. Now we're left with this chaos that, because there is no vision, because we don't have top talent, it's like we're throwing things to the wall to see what sticks and trying to run whichever direction seems like it's going to be a good one, but then not executing it well.
I think a lot of it has to do with Dark Knight's death metal, like the last event book that Greg Capullo and Scott Snyder did. Obviously, it was supposed to be this big culmination, and we were supposed to be moving into 5G, but we ended up getting Future State, which I think was pretty much a bust. There's a couple of good things come out of there, but not much. And since then, they've implemented the Omniverse and these new rules, which essentially removed all the structure and framework of the DC Comics universe itself and let these new, untested, untalented creators jump in there with no restrictions on how they had to treat the characters in the universe. And I think that directly ties into how this happened. We're not talking about Jeff Johns here. We're not talking about Frank Miller, in his prime. We're talking about Stephanie Phillips, who no one's ever heard of. We're talking about Mariko Tamaki coming over from YA graphic novels, coming in to do a Batman 12-issue, weekly event series. And I think every time it's just failed and failed, except for like a Josh Williamson for the most part.
Yeah. And you can even say that part of the reason Josh Williamson has probably made it is because he's tested. He's tried and true. He's been in superhero comics for a while now, and he's proven himself. And he built himself up to this level. These others, they kind of just got handed a golden platter. But I want to touch on what you said about like the way they structure these stories and how like everything matters now. And we always talk about how, well, if everything matters, then nothing matters. But we don't really explain that viewpoint. There are so many iterations of these characters, and we have so many different histories of them, that when you do this, you take out context and you take out nuance. And it's the context and nuance that take stories and make them from okay or good to great, because it really delves into character. It really delves into the history. But now we've got so many character histories that we're delving into and so many different stories that we're touching on from so many different writers, and each writer's running different directions with them, that they all start contradicting one another. So one thing that's happening in one title is contradicting what's happening into another title. And it's important over here for a moment, and then it's not important, it's forgotten over here for a moment. So you've got these stories that are just kind of, they feel like fleeting stories. Like you get it, you feel like it's building to something, and then a month later, there's no purpose to what just happened. It's gone. Fans of comics, we're kind of expected to pick up books monthly, sometimes bi-weekly, and that is an investment. But you've got a company and writers that aren't even investing in their stories. So why should readers invest in the books? And that's why you're seeing a drop in sales. There's not a point to investing. There's not a reason to invest, and there's no payoff for us at the end.
DC Comics are doing kind of like a lot of stunt marketing, gimmick marketing. Obviously the big one was that they're going to do the sexuality change for John Kent, Superman. Mm-hmm. They've done the same thing for Tim Drake, Robin. And we have these new creators come in, and they're doing all these kind of things. We've talked enough about Tom Taylor, but you have a Tim Sheridan, who's not a very good comic writer. Every single comic he's written for DC has been bad. And he's doing interviews talking about this Teen Titans Academy series that he's doing, and he's bragging about what he really wanted to do was to introduce 10 LGBTQ plus representative characters into the story and 10 new characters within there. And then you're at the end, you're like, well, I wonder why it failed. And the reason they had to rely on bringing in a character like Red X from the animated universe just to pique interest in it.
Yeah, it's like it seems like their focus is everywhere except for actually telling a good story. And that's not to say that there aren't good stories out there. There are definitely some books that are good. We talk about Action Comics, we talk about The Flash. Josh Williamson's Batman has been solid, Robin has been solid, but it's so much of the minority, like it's the exception to the rule at this point, that there's, and I'm not even saying great, I'm just saying good, like middle, just above mid-tier good. From an operational standpoint of someone who has worked in a corporate field and run businesses, I can't help but look at what's going on at DC and wonder, like, who is making these decisions and why? Because just from a common sense standpoint, it's like you see bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, and they're not learning from their mistakes. They just keep repeating them. You mentioned the idea of like 10 LGBT characters. I fit in that community. Like I would love to see that, but I want it to be done well. Like if you can't put something more into a character other than that two-dimensional label, if you can't do more than that, then don't do it at all, because it's not worth it. Like you're not going to get an audience. If you come in and you establish a great character and they happen to be gay or they happen to be female or whatever it's going to be, and your purpose is to like, I want to tell a good story with a good character, and this happens to be an element of them, great. But if you can't do that, then just don't even try. Yeah.
So as a DC Comics fan, as someone who's been reading for 30 years, is this the lowest moment for a DC Comics reader, like in modern history? Is this as bad as it gets? Or have there been maybe a 6-month stretch or a year stretch here and there that have actually been worse than this moment right here?
I would say this is the worst, at least as far as I can remember. There were definitely stretches. Like if you go back to the 90s, there was a lot of stuff that wasn't good. And it was too many people trying to catch on to that image boom and do things that are similar to what was really hitting there. And they were trying to be abstract and unique and weird. Some of it landed, some of it didn't. I think the difference between now and then, though, is, especially for me, considering my age in the 90s, is I didn't understand the politics and the behind the scenes like I do now, and I'm not as tapped in. And I know that some people are. Comic shop owners probably were back then, and they were seeing it from a sales perspective. I get that. But I think now with social media, you can't escape this information if you even try to look for it. So for me, I would say now, and if you go back to, I guess it was 2015, DC did DCU, and that was probably the second worst iteration that I can remember. That almost felt like a precursor, like a prologue for what we're getting now. It's like, hey, this is coming in a few years. Buckle up, Buttercup.
Yeah, it's weird how it is cyclical. Obviously, we are in a down period. I don't think a lot of people disagree with that, but that means it's got to go up to an up period.
Yeah,
there's got to be a rebound. They got to bring in some creators. Hey. Somebody's going to find their footing, and we're going to have a renaissance.
Yeah, I don't want to be the guy that just leans towards Batman. Like I've read plenty of other DC Batmans where my passion is, but just the mere fact that we're getting Chip Zdarsky writing Batman and then Ram V writing Detective Comics with some solid art behind it still, dude, like that is what we need to see. Those are great signs. So if we can start doing this with other titles, please let's go. I'm here.
DC needs to do something with a character besides Batman, though. They need to prioritize Justice League, Flash, Green Lantern, Superman, Wonder Woman, and really get some of the foundational characters, the pillars of the DC Comics universe reestablished, kind of fixed, and then you start fleshing it out with other characters. But right now, it feels like there was only one pillar. He's a big shaft right there. It is Batman. That's all they got.
Was that a penis joke?
It might have been.
No, I completely agree. You know, I think if there's anything, knock on wood, for DC, there's really no other place to go other than up. So, yeah, let's go up.
One of the real issues DC Comics has had for years has been character deconstruction. One of the worst culprits is Tom King, but another writer that came in from Marvel and pretty much destroyed one of the foundational pillar pieces of DC Comics was Brian Michael Bendis with his Superman run. In this video, it's old. There's some audio issues in here, but I do play out a lot of really good information how Brian Michael Bendis absolutely hosed Superman and started the destruction of the DC Comics universe. We got here today because of this guy right here.